Welcome to the NASC Preferred Supplier webinar, how to turn recall crisis into normal business process. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for this webinar, which we hope will be a continuing series of information for all of our membership and folks in the industry. I'd like to talk a little bit about why we chose this topic. We chose it for several reasons, not least of which is the fact that it's timely, with several significant recalls taking place in the recent weeks. And as far as NASC is concerned, our membership, we take pride in the fact that our membership is taking every effort to do things the right way. But the fact of the matter is we are an industry of human beings operating in an imperfect world. And that just removes any hope for immunity for things going wrong. So they do. It's always a good idea to be able to be proactive in preparing for any eventuality. And recalls of a product is just another one of those things. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. First is Roger Hancock. He's President and CEO of Recall InfoLink, which was founded in 2007. Before that, he spent over 16 years at Albertsons as Director of Food Safety and Q&A, where he directed 250 recalls a year and spearheaded the company's adoption of new technologies to improve the recall process. Roger brings a wealth of recall experience to the Recall InfoLink team, and is changing the face of global product recall management. Jim Flannery is CEO of Summit Ventures, a consumer product consultancy that helps brands grow their business by building consumer and trading partner trust. Jim spent 6 years as Senior Executive VP of the Grocery Manufacturers Association and 36 years with Procter & Gamble. Through volunteer leadership positions, Jim played an instrumental role in the creation of the Consumer Goods Forum and also led the CPG industry's effort to develop and launch the Smart Label Transparency Initiative. Dr. David Atchison is a founder, president, and CEO of the Atchison Group, and he has over 30 years of medical and food safety experience. He was Chief Medical Officer for USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Services and FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Director of CFSAN's Office of Food Defense, Communication and Emergency Response, and FDA Assistant and then Associate Commissioner of Foods, where he developed the 2007 Food Protection Plan that was the basis for many authorities of FSMA. Dr. Atchison is a fellow of London's Royal College of Physicians and the Infectious Disease Society of America. Dr. Anna Brutlag is Director of Veterinary Services and a partner at Safety Call International, also one of our preferred suppliers, and Poison Helpline, a 24/7 animal and human poison control center that serves the public and industry. Anna is a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology and the American Board of Veterinary Toxicology, as well as an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota's College of Veterinary Medicine. Her areas of expertise include clinical toxicology, adverse event management, post-market product drug safety, and regulatory compliance. She has personally managed over 30,000 cases involving potentially poisoned pets. That, as you can tell, we've got several well-voiced panelists. And to start, I'll go ahead and kick it over to Anna, and she will start with her thoughts on the importance of product safety and key factors in assessing whether a recall is necessary. And I'll turn it over to you, Anna.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you, NASC, for inviting me. I'm honored to be a part of this esteemed panel. So I'm starting because, as Bill mentioned, I'm with Safety Call International. We're a poison control center, a licensed healthcare practice that's focused on post-market surveillance, and we manage adverse events for a variety of companies, many who are NASC members, but a variety of companies across multiple industries, including supplement industry, drugs, animal health, biologics, ag, consumer products, etc. So as a 24/7 poison control center with an expertise in clinical toxicology, we're the ones taking in adverse events in real time as they happen. And our medical professionals are assessing, triaging, and assisting those who are calling in, be it a consumer or a healthcare professional, a veterinarian, physician, et cetera. So we operate both a human and an animal poison control business. Now, the reason I'm starting to kick things off here is because when you have a product that comes back with an out of specification, or you have adverse events that are reported that are quite concerning, that's the trigger for doing a deeper dive to figure out if a recall is necessary. So I'd like to talk you through a little bit about how we approach that and what our steps are and the questions that we ask in order to, again, figure out if you're going to move to that recall stage. So our first step, and we help our clients with this, and we do this routinely, is when there's a potential problem, we perform a health hazard evaluation. So that is, it's creating a risk assessment effectively, where you're able to tell your story, tell the story of the events as they occurred, you lay out the risk, and you use that document to really explain the foundation of the actions that you are then going to take. So our job is to help you characterize the risk as best as possible so you can make the appropriate decisions. There are 4 standard questions that I always ask in these situations. The first, have there been any reports of illness or injury from the affected product? To answer this, you need to have a robust, comprehensive way to capture adverse events. And you need to be familiar with what your adverse event data says. You need to understand that baseline data and the background noise that's part of that baseline. Because from there, you can confidently demonstrate that you've been coding and analyzing these adverse events. So if there is a signal, you can determine, is that signal relevant? Is it a meaningful change from baseline with regard to either the frequency of an adverse event or the intensity of an adverse event? And if there are no adverse events, that's fine. That's great. That puts you in an even better position. And you can confidently say that we have a program in place to make sure that we are collecting adverse events, and therefore we can confidently say we don't have any. And that's very meaningful information. So the next question we'll ask in a situation like this are looking at your target market. Is the target population that you're selling this product to, are there any existing medical conditions or other conditions that might put an individual at further risk of adverse consequences if they were to consume or be exposed to the affected product? So here's where you take your medical judgment to really understand the health and the welfare of that target population, so you can understand what the affected product could in fact do. So for example, if you're selling a calming supplement for dogs, is it reasonable that a large population of those dogs might be on other behavior modifying drugs? And if so, what could be the interaction between whatever the adulterant is in this particular product and the drugs that you expect your target population to be on? Now, next, we look at how serious of a health hazard does the affected product pose? Because it's really important to know that not all specification breaches are created equal. Some are incidental and they don't affect the safety of the product. They don't affect the safety of an exposed individual, and a recall would not be something that would not be the recommended next step. So you need to be able to articulate, what will happen to that pet or that person if they consume or they're exposed to this product. And again, what's the worst case scenario? So from a medical standpoint, those are the questions that, again, we're asking with respect to the seriousness of this. And then finally, we're asking how likely is it that any given patient will actually experience adverse consequences? Now, to answer this question, you really need to know what your market penetration is and where is that product in the supply chain. Has it left the warehouse? No, that's great. Then certainly no one's going to be exposed at the consumer level. Is it in the hands of a distributor? Is it on the shelf? And that obviously will help drive, again, that risk assessment. If it is on the shelf and people have been purchasing this, how long has it been out in the market? And if it's been out in the market a while, again, do you have adverse events? Don't you? All of these pieces are put together in your health hazard evaluation to really help you understand, again, where to take that next step. And finally, one question I always ask of our clients and encourage them to think about is, how will this specification breach be interpreted by consumers. Now, that may have nothing to do with the actual health hazard risk that we're talking about, but let's say, for example, you sell a liquid supplement product that's normally blue in color. And while it's sitting on the shelf, there's some innocuous change that makes that supplement turn from blue to pink. This color change has no impact on safety. It doesn't affect the ultimate, it certainly won't cause adverse events in the target consuming population. But you can bet that consumers are going to be very concerned about this. And you're going to see lots of calls and you're going to have demand action. What are you doing about this? How can you assure me this is safe? This is such an obvious change. There clearly must be something wrong. So sometimes too, initiating recalls is not always because there's a significant health impact that could happen to those consumers or to your patients. And it's so another thing that's worth thinking about as a company who's putting product out there. Now, I'll close by just saying, my father's a pilot. And so for years, I've heard him say, if, in the airline industry, it's always better to be on the ground, looking up and wishing you were in the air than to be on the air, wishing you were in the ground. So I think, yes, point well taken, Dad. I still think about this after hearing it years and years. And I think the next speakers are going to tee that up very well. What happens? How can you prevent that standpoint when you're up in the air, you're wishing you were on the ground? These things are going to happen. Recalls are going to happen. How can we really take the pain out of that? And how can you be prepared as a business to have the pieces in place that are going to be necessary for you to make this a much less painful event? So thank you. Bill, turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to throw some additional questions out there. Just to let everyone know, we will have Q&A turned on. So if any of our attendees have any questions, go ahead and type those in, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end of our presentation. But the first question I'm going to throw out there is, what are the pain points of recall? And I'll go ahead and address that to you, David.
Well, thanks, Bill. And, Anna, I thank you for that introduction. Your analogy of being in the air and wishing you were on the ground was a really good one. And that resonates with somebody who flies a lot. You hope you're never in that situation. But as you said, recalls will happen. Doesn't matter how good you are, you'll get tangled up in a recall. And it may be nothing that you've done, but somebody who's made an error or had a problem in your upstream supply chain and calls you and say, hey, we're in a recall mode and we're just passing it down the line. So the pain points can be extreme. And I think the first thing that when you're thinking about, I'm in a recall mode, the first element of pain is, what do I recall? How much do I recall? What's the scope of it? And that means you need to build a system to understand what the scope is of a problem, so that if you get a call from that supplier saying, this ingredient, this product that I sent you is problematic, where is it? Do you have it under your control? Have you shipped it on? Have you sold it to customers? And within that, Roger and I were chatting a little bit before we started, is the difference between a traceback ability and a recall ability. And they are inherently very different. What I'm going to talk about with pain points and during the course of this is the holistic recognition that being recall ready is a big undertaking. The ability to trace product is exactly that, tracing product. Where is it? So as we begin the pain, the first thing is, do I have a capability of doing root cause? If I caused the problem, do I have the expertise in-house or outsourced? What caused the problem? What, as I call it, the bookends of my recall. When did the problem begin? When did it end? Or am I looking at having to recall everything that's still got shelf life? Obviously, you want to try to narrow that. So that's one of your first pain points. Second pain point I want to get into, which is key for a recall, is your reputation. That's one of the things that you can come out of a recall, actually, believe it or not, with a very intact, if not enhanced reputation. Because the way you handle it says a lot about your ability and your competence and your capabilities. And I think American consumers, individuals, the public, understand recalls happen. What they hate is when it's all confusing and there's mixed messages and they don't know what to do. And that's all about how you communicate, and you are protecting your reputation. And a key part of planning for all of this is to have all this pain figured out before it happens. So building a program around understanding, now, who do I have to worry about with my reputation? And that, depending where you are, that may be your customers if you're B2B. It may be the public, consumers, if there's an element of B2C that's going to be impacted. You've got the reputation with regulators. Wherever you are in the system, somebody's regulating you, and that plays a big part. You've got investors potentially in the business, owners, and you've got your employees. And the list of people that you need to think about in terms of maintaining that reputation are key. And managing that pain and coming out of the other side looking good, you won't feel good, but you hope to look good, is thinking about reputation. The next area of pain is regulatory compliance. I think every company that's involved in a recall is like, oh, what are the regulators going to do to me? Am I in trouble? Am I going to get a fine? Is this going to happen? Or is that happen? And I think regulatory agencies recognize the whole point of a recall is a preventive action. It's to prevent people from getting. We found a problem, and animals got sick or humans got sick. And so there is a significant regulatory component to that. Whatever regulatory agency is looking after you, or who you are under. So understanding how to manage that is also an important part of reducing the pain. Do you understand what you might need to report to the Food and Drug Administration, for example, and how you do it? Who do you contact? What are those phone numbers? So you're not scrambling. The next pain point is legal, litigation, which is a double-edged sword. You might find that you're on the receiving end of legal action. People have got sick, they blame you. You're being sued by plaintiff attorneys, by other companies, because what you have put into the marketplace has either cost them something or has caused illness. And that triggers a potential litigation cascade. The other part of that is you may find that you need to get involved in litigation to actually sue somebody who sent you something that was bad, because they're denying it, and you've got no choice to recall because you've looked at the facts that Anna laid out, and you've said, I got to recall this product. I don't believe it's safe. And you call your supplier and say, we got a problem here. And they say, no, you don't. Don't worry about it. But back to number one, your reputation matters. I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to recall this. And you believe you are right. And whoa, you're into litigation with your supplier. And then the financial is my final pain point, is recognizing that recalls come with typically a ginormous and horrible price tag. There's no such thing as a quick, easy, cheap recall. And understanding that is key. Obviously, you want to try to limit the damage, but going right back to that first pain point of the reputation and the regulatory compliance, there's certain things that you just have to do. And the financial consequences of a recall can be a huge pain point. You might be able to subrogate some of that cost back upstream to your supplier. With a bit of luck, you have product recall insurance that will help cover some of the costs, and that's a very important thing to think about. But clearly, I could go on and on and on about pain, because the pain in recalls is huge. But ultimately, the best analgesic for this pain is to be prepared. Have systems in place that are going to manage that pain. And with that, I will hand back to Bill, and we will hear a little bit about solutions.
Yeah. Hey, David, before we go on solution, I want to build a little bit on the pain point through a little bit of a different lens. So my background has been on the supplier side of the business, and I'm going to pull on your being in the air thread, right? So I got my pilot license. And I remember going through the pilot license with the trainer, and all of a sudden he reaches over and turns the engine on. I'm like, he turns it off. I go, what'd you do? He goes, all right, your engine just failed. What are you going to do? And it was absolute panic, right? Do I start the engine? Where do I land? How do I do? And back to David's point from a supplier, We have all kinds of resources and processes in place to make sure our product is good, right? And that's the basis of trust in our whole industry, is that product performs as promised and it's not harmful. But every once in a while, something goes wrong. And in my experience, and for a large company like a Procter and Gamble, it is kind of a crisis panic mode. In fact, Roger and I were looking at some data a couple of years ago. The average manufacturer probably has to go through a product recall once every 3 years. So when it happens, it's like that. It's like the trainer reaching over and turning your engine off. What do I do? And there's a tremendous amount of pain in that, because it's always learning all over again if you don't have practice processes in place, right? So one of the things we talk about is, you don't run your first fire drill when your building's on fire. You don't practice landing without an engine when you have to. You practice it ahead. So there's a lot of work that goes into ensuring the products are good. We practice, we trace, we do all that. But what we don't do is take it to that other step about, okay, now I've got to get it out of the supply chain to actually protect my consumers and my brand's reputation. How do I do that? And there's a tremendous amount of pain in figuring that out. On the other side of the coin, and this is how I got involved in the GMA days, working with the retailer or distributor community. For an average manufacturer that goes through a recall once every 3 years, a typical retailer deals with one weekly, all right? And they get that information from the supplier community in all different formats. Oftentimes it's incomplete. There are times it's inaccurate. Sometimes it's not fast. And that creates a tremendous amount of pain. We had this project in the Trading Partner Alliance, we called it, that really was, how do you communicate to the retailers so the retailers get all the information simultaneously with or within 30 minutes of any kind of public release on a product recall? Because there's nothing worse than having a consumer come into the store, pick up that bag of dog food and say, I just heard this is recalled. How come it's still on the shelf? So that panic mode from a manufacturer without a practice process in place is really painful. And then the variety of ways that information gets to the retailer is even more painful on their end. And in the end, they're the ones that have to pull the product from the shelf, right? They've got to get it out of that supply chain. So really two big pain points there.
Now, good additions. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
Listening to both of you talk, it brings me to this concept of tension. And there's tension throughout the room when a recall is happening. Your operators want to minimize the scope of the recall. Your quality team wants to expand the scope of the recall to make sure they got everything. The finance people want to control the cost of the recall. The logistics people are fearing how much extra time and energy they're going to have to put retrieving the recall. And so there's tension all over the place with these recalls. And the best, I appreciate David's comment, the best analgesic for that tension is the same analgesic. If you practice ahead of time an actual scenario that's likely to occur, you can anticipate what tensions are going to arise. You can anticipate how much information the regulators are going to ask you for. You can anticipate how much extra cost you're going to have to build into your P&L to cover reverse logistics, to cover product destruction, to cover product credits. You can anticipate how much documentation you're going to have to capture, and if you have a way to capture that, so that you can provide a concise claim to your product recall insurance provider. So a lot of the analgesic or practice is thinking, okay, not only where are the pain points, because a lot of the pain points come from where's the tension. The tension is the regulators want information that isn't easy for me to access, or the insurance adjuster is going to want to know not only who I communicated with, but what did I tell them? When did I know it? And so there's going to be a whole documentation need. So just this idea of practicing ahead of time in a comprehensive way, getting all of the different voices in the room so that you can anticipate what tensions you're going to have to solve and how you're going to protect your brand, because the ultimate tension is, as Jim kind of alluded to, is, am I going to lose trust with my consumers? Is my business going to tank because of this recall? Or as David mentioned, you can come out of a recall with a heightened sense of trust because you can communicate to your consumers, hey, we've got your back. We have a system in place that's going to let us act really quickly, really strategically to protect you. So great conversation so far. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to move on to the next question, and that's going to be what are reasonable solutions to that pain, to those pain points? And I'll have Jim go ahead and start with that one.
Great, thanks, Bill. Yeah, I want to draw from the that Trading Partner Alliance effort that we put together, which was simply there's got to be a better way. How do everybody that's impacted on this recall come together? And while the solutions are principally really simple, it requires an infrastructure to make it work. So the solution from a manufacturer, and again, in my career with P&G and in the grocery manufacturers, I painfully dealt with some of these recalls. Today, the communication of the recall tends to happen in a series of handoffs, right? So a subject matter expert says, okay, I need a recall. These are the products that need to be recalled. Here's the disposition. Here's how to talk to consumers about what's happening. Now, I've got to get that information out to 30 retailers, 100 retailers, 6 retailers, whatever the number is. The typical process flow is that subject matter expert sends it to the account exec responsible for that retailer. The account exec then translates it into that retailer for their system, and then action takes. And it's like, I'm going to date myself here, but remember growing up, you used to play that game Whispers, where you get 12 people in a room and somebody starts and whispers into the ear, and by the time it goes around, that message is totally different than how it started. And that's what happens with this series of handoffs. So the first part of that solution is to find a way that subject matter experts can communicate, as a single source of the truth, communicate that recall information to everybody that's impacted in the way they need to see it. Right. So if we can do that, and there are GS1 global open standards that have been written in order to do that, but now we just need to leverage those standards. And then, frankly, from the retailer side, I'm glad somebody chimed in, because my passion for this was, frankly, and I'll give for those of you who know him, Joe Sheridan at Wakeford, a lot of kudos for this. Over cocktails one evening, he was just going on and on about the complexity of dealing with it from a retailer. The retailers need to get the information in the way they need to see it. And again, if it's based on these GS1 global open standards, 99% of the retailers can accept the information that way, and it flows. They need to get that information in the way they need to see it. They need to get it fast, complete, and accurate. And then there needs to be a reporting mechanism, right? So if we can leverage these standards, so as a supplier, the single source of the truth gets to the retailer in the way they want to see it, they can communicate it to their stores. And then there's that feedback loop. So ultimately, the consumer is not protected. Your brand reputation is not protected until you've got complete visibility to, was the action I needed to take place, did it actually take place? Was that product removed from the point of sale, or the consumers and the brands protected? So those are the solutions, I believe. Practice those recalls, and then single source the truth in the way that the retailers need to see it, that can make this much more effective.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks,
you
Jim.
wanted, yeah.
Another part of the solution, I believe, is connected to something, again, that Dr. Atchison said when he talked about the confusion that recalls often create when I was at Albertsons, we do a recall. Just a quick story here. And the company's consumer response department always had to kind of go into overtime mode and solve lots of problems because we had 2,000 different stores giving 2,000 different versions of the truth when the customer would ask you, what's happening with this recall. And so for one day, I was a hero to the customer service department when we started sending out a question and answer document to each of the stores so that everyone could say the same thing about the recall. And when everyone was saying the same thing, the confusion decreased dramatically, which led to fewer calls in wanting to know the reasonable explanation. And so a reasonable solution to the pain, like Jim said, it's important that we communicate quickly to everybody, but it's also important that we communicate consistent messaging to everybody, because the retailers that are doing these things weekly aren't processing their own recalls. They're processing a recall for their supplier. And so having help from the supplier to know exactly how to talk about it, how to answer questions, how to minimize confusion is really important part to a brand's protection and to quick processing of a recall. The last thing you want to do is create confusion. And so a reasonable solution has to include packaging up consistent talking points, consistent messaging for everyone involved, because distributors go to retailers, and anymore today, manufacturers do online direct sales as a result of COVID-19. Retailers go to consumers. So there's all these different touch points that need to have a consistent, understandable, accurate message to what's going on to minimize confusion. I think that has to be part of the reasonable solution.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you also, Jim. Before I give the last question, I just want to mention that Recall InfoLink is one of our preferred suppliers, and you can absolutely take a look at their listing on the preferred supplier section of the NASC site. And the last question is, I'll let Roger address it, is why is Recall InfoLink a good solution for preparedness for a recall?
Thanks, Bill. I think the best reason, David mentioned traceability, and the FDA did a low, no-cost traceability challenge for traceability systems that work in the marketplace to help create visibility to a product's life cycle, from the farm to the fork, or from manufacturer to retail. And there's a lot of confusion about how traceability and recalls are connected. Some people think they're the same thing, but they really aren't. And so I think the biggest reason why Recall InfoLink is a good solution to this recall pain that we've been talking about is because Recall InfoLink focuses exclusively on the recall process. And so we help our clients manage the recall process. Anna talked about the questions that are really important to answer to make a decision about whether or not you need to recall a product. And those are important questions, and they need to have the right players in the room so that you get to the right answer. Once that decision is made, then executing the recall quickly, accurately, and efficiently is the most important thing a business can do. And it doesn't make sense to use a recall module of a front-end system or a recall module of a traceability system that makes it a traceability exercise. It really makes sense to partner with a recall solution that you don't have to build, that you don't have to learn, that you can just log into because you've done it before as a practice exercise. You can log into, put your information in, push go, and have 100% confidence that all of your trading partners, all of your customers get the information they need to know, how they need to see it quickly and efficiently, and they can close the loop. So with thousands of recalls of experience, you know, Bill, you mentioned that I did 250 a year at Albertsons. Well, it doesn't take a lot of math to say 16 years, 250, that's a lot. Last year, Recall InfoLink processed more than 1,900 recalls through our system for our customers. And you all can imagine that recall activity in 2020 due to COVID was significantly decreased compared to 2019. 2019, we did more than 2,500 of these exercises. And from the time of logging in to the time of pushing go to start the communication, notification, response process, on average across all those 4,000 recalls is under 20 minutes, actually 15 minutes and 45 seconds. So we create an efficiency, we streamline around GS1 global open standards, as Jim mentioned, a way to take the pain out of this process, to do it quickly, to do it efficiently, to use a practiced process. We have a practice service that we offer to clients twice a year. You can just practice, full access to the system, full support, full visibility, full questions answered when you run into a question that you're not sure about. So I think that that's kind of an outline of why we're the best solution. I could get into lots of details, and we'd be happy to do that with your customers. But that's kind of an overview of why we think that we fill this. Quite frankly, also are honored that you and Bill Bookout and the NASC team have also agreed, yeah, you guys kind of do this best in class of the solutions that are available. So thank you very much. We'd be happy to answer questions,
Roger,
hear other comments. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, if I could just build on it, and I don't know if the folks on the phone are familiar with me, but after my career, I retired from P&G, retired from GMA, and both of my P&G and GMA days, I touched this recall space pretty much, and so I've gotten really interested in working with Roger and the Recall InfoLink team, because I really believe that they're onto something that can help protect consumers and protect brands better than anything that I've seen out there. So as an industry, going back a couple of years, we spent all kind of time understanding what needs to do and be done and how it needs to be done. So I'll call them attributes, the information that retailers say they need in order to execute a recall. Working with the GS1 group, we created the standards so that infrastructure has been in place for years. But frankly, no one's picked it up and run with it yet. I'm going to add to that in the conversations with the FDA and the new era of smarter food safety. There's a line in there about enhancing connectivity with the reportable food registry. So I don't know if the folks on this call deal with the RFR much at all, but we've again been working with them fairly consistently on making sure that the attributes, the XML communication is accurate, and we're fairly close to working with them to create XML schema and an endpoint. So if you think about this solution where subject matter experts goes to one place, loads all the information necessary for a recall, the product, the disposition, all the information that the FDA needs for the reportable food registry, to this conversation about messaging, making sure that the stores are equipped with the right message. So when a consumer asks a question, hey, this is a recall, this has to do with your health or safety, or frankly, this is a voluntary withdrawal. Anna, to your example before, the green color isn't right. So if you've got some in your house, don't panic. This is just a recall. Getting all that information together in one location is exactly what the Recall InfoLink system does. All right, it takes the user a short period of time to input all the information they have, and then it goes right out to all the entities that are impacted by that retail. Recall, it could be retailers. We have a number of retailers that we work with that actually take that information, and they're extended clients of ours, where not only we get that information to their store, but we link into their loyalty card data to get that information directly in the hands of their consumers. But it gets all that information out there fast and consistent. And then it's got that magic on the back end, right? So if you're executing that recall, not only do you have the single source of truth that's going out to all the entities that are impacted, but in a real-time basis, you can see, okay, I have this recall and it's going to go to 300 different entities who confirm that they've been notified of the recall, right? So the minute I send it out, I can see, okay, within an hour, 20, 30% have received all the information they need. These are the people that I haven't. I've got to follow up with them. And then more importantly is I can understand and what action was taken. Okay, so what percent of the impacted retail got the information, and then how many of them took the action? So I can look myself in the eye and say my consumer's protected. I can look at the regulators in the eye and say that information has flowed. That's where Recall InfoLink has grabbed the hold of global open standards that the industry has said have been necessary for a long time, and actually built a solution around it. So, just a little bit of kudos to Roger and his team about taking this idea and really scaling it up.
Jim, to build off what you just said, I think, and it sort of ties a little bit into the new era of smarter food safety, because, I think we're all saying here, accuracy and speed are really critical in terms of handling one of these things efficiently, to go back to one of my pain points about maintaining your reputation intact. Being prepared through systems and solutions like Recall InfoLink, it sort of builds in that speed and that connectivity. And I'm sure many of those on the call sort of can think of a situation where you're involved in commerce around a product, and you read on the news or you hear through social media, such and such a product has been recalled. In the food world, let's say somebody's recalled mangoes, and you sell mangoes, and you're looking at the mangoes you're selling, and you think, well, I haven't been contacted. Are they part of the recall? What should I do? Do I pull them off the shelf to protect my customers, or do I just leave them there and continue to sell them? Because if I pull them off and it's on me, then financial consequences. So having that speed and interconnectivity is really key. And it goes back to, again, an analogy from the food world back to 2009, when there was ongoing recalls from peanut butter, and a problem with salmonella. And those recalls began in January, and they went through to April, because individuals in the supply chain downstream of that original manufacturer didn't know that they'd received product that was under the initial recall. It ultimately resulted in almost 4,000 recalls that spanned over 4 or 5 months. So looking, as you're sort of saying, well, could I be in a recall situation? Sure. And looking for those connectivity solutions, so quickly and accurately whether you're in or you're out. And systems like Recall InfoLink that connect the dots are absolutely critical in today's environment of needing to move fast and needing to move right.
It's a great point, David. And again, pulling from my experience, the store that was at the end of the call list, if they happened to get called by the district manager before they got called by the recall notification service, was kind of at a loss, because the DM was hammering them for why they hadn't executed a recall yet that they hadn't even heard about. And often when notification is a manual process, you prioritize who you're going to call based on customer status, size of business, whatever. Well, how do you explain to the 100th person on the list that they had to wait to get the information and they feel exposed? I mean, we actually serve clients who have sold cantaloupes that ended up causing harm to the people who bought the cantaloupes. And they said, well, we didn't hear about the cantaloupe recall before they were using our service. We didn't hear about the cantaloupe recall fast enough. And so we sold them. And we have records that we sold them at this time, and we heard about the recall, you know, these 3 hours later, and there was nothing that we could do.
Mm.
And so it puts you in a really awkward position if you're having to prioritize who gets notified when. And some people have to wait for hours, or in the case of the peanut butter recall, days or weeks to even learn that they got the product. So digitizing this process, automating it, brings a lot of compression to the amount of time that people have to wait. It protects your brand. Also, it has a huge impact on the economics of the recall. The faster you do the recall, the smaller your claims are going to be, the smaller your expenses are going to be. There's some well-documented cases where dragging your feet to actually pull the trigger to do the recall, to make the decisions that Anna was talking about before, can cost you not only millions of dollars, but can cost you huge brand reputation damage. So yeah, great points.
Thanks, guys. I have a question. You guys may be able to see this in the chat, but it came across as a question. When it comes to consistent messaging, sometimes store leaders confuse a product recall with a product withdrawal and use the terms interchangeably. Do you know of retailers who educate the stores on the subject when there's such a high turnover rate? And can this be a challenge?
Yeah, I'll jump in as a start there. Honestly, with the kind of turnover at retail, and there's a project I'm working on right now that I've got more retail experience than I've ever thought I'd have in my entire life. With the turnover at retail, I'm not sure that the ability to keep up with that turnover so that the people impacted are as educated is ever going to be achievable. I think what's really clear is the message needs to go through the system untouched, right? So if there's a recall, the store needs to be able to post or at least have available all the information about the recall. If it's a withdrawal, then that store manager or whoever's going to implement that recall needs to get that notification that this is a voluntary product withdrawal. And here's what that means. And all that's in the messaging that should come out from that subject matter expert.
And then that actually, there's another question out there about the messaging. Is there a great potential for a completely different message to come from the retailer who hasn't gotten messaging in a timely fashion from the manufacturer involved? Is that something that happens often?
So again, in my experience, I think the answer is yes. I was talking to a retailer the other day who was all worked up because one of the consumers in their store heard about this recall from a social media post before it ever got to the store, and the social media post was making some justifications, wrong word, reasons for the recall that were kind of blown out of proportion. So the store manager was then just propagating a little bit of hysteria, frankly, on what the consumer had on the post. So yeah, I mean, if the message doesn't get out complete, accurate, and fast, especially in an era of social media, it can go off in any direction. So that consistency of message is really important.
And let me add a little bit of more color to that. If I'm doing, and it's around the word often, if I'm doing 250 recalls a year, it's about 5 a week. If the wrong messaging gets out 3 times during that year, well, that's about 1%. That is not often. However, if I'm one of those 3 manufacturers and the wrong messaging got out, it's the only recall, as Jim pointed out, it might be the only recall that I've done in the last 3 or 5 years. That's 100% of the time. That's often. And so as the recall owner, I want to make sure that recall messaging is delivered fast and accurate 100% of the time, because my brand is at risk. And so, yeah, these communication things, quite frankly, are some of the biggest pain points. Now, people think of money and they think of regulatory compliance as the big pain points, but underlying all that is proper communication and making sure that the proper message is delivered so that you have the right message to hang on the shelf. Takes it out of the hands of store personnel if you're saying, here's the accurate message for this lot code of products. It was a voluntary recall because the color wasn't standing up under the fluorescent lights of the retail store or whatever. Yeah, we just keep building on the same thing. Getting the information out quickly and accurately is going to support the consumer, it's going to support the B2B relationship, and it's going to protect the brand.
And Roger, that speaks to the criticality of good communication strategies. Obviously, we talked about efficiency and speed and scope and execution of a recall, which are all absolutely critical. But the communication side of a recall or a market withdrawal is key. And I think for any company, a recall or being involved in a recall, to some degree, has the potential to be a crisis. For a retailer, obviously, you're doing 5 a week. You don't have 5 crises a week, but any one of them could go horribly sideways if you don't get the right message and you inadvertently fail to pull the right product. And you know, you can just see where it can blow up. So the communication piece of it, I don't think can be underestimated, and being prepared on that side is a key part of just being ready, and it's part of the preparedness drill for sure.
Yeah, and I'm not going to bash P&G because Jim's on the phone, but this was after Jim left. One of the last recalls I did, P&G gave us one set of items to recall on the West Coast, one set of items to recall on the East Coast, and one set of items to recall on the Midwest, because as Jim said, it was the account executive calling on the buyer in each of those locations, handing off the recall information. And it turned out that none of those item lists was 100% accurate. They were all accurate in what they communicated, but they weren't complete. And so, yeah, thinking through all of the different parts of a recall that have to be communicated, and that have to be communicated to the people who need to see it in the way they need to see it, is something that you don't want to have to do in the crisis or in the tension of a recall that's happening. Quite frankly, you want to have a system that's going to guide you through, make sure that you're covering all these touch points so that you can sleep well at night when you go home having done a recall. And you can look at the scorecard that shows you, okay, this percentage has responded, this percentage is being notified again, this percentage needs to take additional action. So yeah, I think we've done a good job today of characterizing the kind of the multifaceted components of recalls and how bringing them all together in one place and managing them in one place really provides a ton of additional value to the entire supply chain.
Roger. Another question that came through is, and Roger, you touched on this briefly. As far as mock recalls are concerned, and that type of preparedness, is that something that companies can do often, regularly? Is that something that they can do in preparedness for a recall, even if it's not one pending? Or
absolutely, Bill, that's absolutely actually the best time to do it, because heads are level and questions can be asked without a threatening tone, and the processes can be probed a little bit. So I think a best practice for mock recalls is twice a year. And the best practice around scenarios is don't always do the same thing. Some of our clients actually say, well, do one mock recall around finished product, do a second recall around an ingredient coming in, like the peanut butter example that David mentioned. Another reason to do a recall would be around packaging. It hasn't been quite as frequent, but recently you could say a third of all recalls are in the FDA space are because of inaccurate packaging, particularly tied to allergen statements. And so, doing a mock recall around, well, we put two lots of product in packaging that didn't have a correct statement because we changed our formula, but we didn't change our packaging. Doing a couple of mock recalls a year is a best practice. Mixing up the scenario so that you're getting people thinking in different ways and answering different questions is a best practice. And it turns what would be a crisis when the occasion for a real recall occurs, when something, as Jim said, when the infrequent occurrence where something does go wrong, it turns that exercise into a normal business process. You log into the system, you put in the information that you're confident is going to communicate clearly. And so, yeah, twice a year, used to be once a year was kind of the best practice recommendation, but then as employee turnover increases, as regulations change, as just the business world changes, it made sense to bump that once a year up to twice a year, just to make sure that companies feel confident in their preparedness. Good question, Bill. Thanks.
One last question. We're getting close to the 1 o'clock hour, so I'll make this brief. As far as the threshold of when to pull the trigger on a recall voluntarily, how much of a moving target is that? Is it something that can be cut and dried in the name of preparedness, or is it a criteria that is very fluid?
That's a big question to end on, and I'm sure that both David and Anna have thoughts. I would say it's a risk assessment type of question that probably is particular to each company.
Sure.
In terms of the products that they're producing, who their customer base is, et cetera, particular to each company, and in some ways particular to each incident, because the incident has its own peculiarities. And so really it in some ways it is a moving threshold. Yeah, but other comments would be welcome.
I'll jump in quick on that. To me, it goes right back to what risk are we talking about? And if it's a situation that is going to threaten life to an animal or a human, you've got to move really quickly. And if you don't, the regulators will. If it's a quality issue at the other end of the spectrum, you have all the time you want, and there's everything in between. So it's absolutely a series of moving parts, which, going back to the HHE and Anna's comment, that's what's key. You got to know what you're doing before you get into it. So practice, practice, practice. Twice a year is really good.
Yes, I would echo that. I don't know if I have more to add. I think it's very important. Each situation is slightly different. Each question that you ask, you're building the answer. Each answer that you build is going to pull from that very specific situation. And no situation, you're going to have generalities between situations, but none of them are going to be exactly the same. And those slight differences between them can mean a lot when it comes to the ultimate risk story that you're creating. So agreed.
And I think that just my final thought that is, so it goes back to the pain points, is the recall is a piece of it, but If this gets big enough, and depending where you are in the supply chain, it truly is a crisis for a company that can be impacting on the P&L, and that's a crisis in, I think, in anybody's book. And looking at it through that holistic, do you have the escalation processes, the health hazard evaluation systems, the scientists, the toxicologists, whatever you need, are they all sort of on speed dial so you know what to do? Because you need to have that all figured out before it happens, because when it happens, you are in an absolute tailspin. And you're, you know, as to going full circle here, you're in the air, the plane is going down, and you're thinking, I wish I was on the ground, knowing that you will be, but you want to land softly, and that's key. Landing softly in a recall is success.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah. With that, we've reached the end of the hour. I want to thank all of you for taking part, and I want to thank everyone who attended. Really great content from you guys, and thank you so much for being part of NASC and supporting what we do. And like I said, a lot of great information. With that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.